Imagine sitting in a room filled with the cigars, champagne, and the rustle of expensive suits. Outside, snow falls gently on the streets of Berlin. The year is 1884. Around a massive table, 14 European men, diplomats, ambassadors, representatives of empires are drawing lines across a map. But this is no ordinary map, it's Africa, a continent of 500 million acres, home to thousands of kingdoms, languages, and ancient civilizations stretching back millennia. And in this room, over the course of 3 months, these men will divide it all without a single African voice present, no kings, no queens, no representatives, no consent, just pens, rulers, and ambition. This is the story of how Africa was carved up like a cake at a dinner party. This is the story of the Berlin Conference, the meeting that changed the fate of an entire continent. And what happened in that room would echo for more than a century. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. I'm your host. And today we are diving into one of the most consequential events in African history, an event that most Africans never witnessed, yet shaped every border, every conflict, and every political struggle lying on the continent today. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 is often called the Scramble for Africa. But that phrase makes it sound chaotic, accidental, like a race where everyone just happened to show up at the same time. The truth is far more calculated. This was a summit, a negotiation, a deliberate, organized effort by European powers to claim African land, resources, and people as their own. And they did it with rules, treaties, and legal language, all designed to make colonization look civilized. In this documentary, we'll explore what Africa looked like before the conference. Thriving kingdoms, powerful rulers, and complex societies. Why European powers suddenly wanted to divide Africa in the 1880s. What actually happened in that conference room in Berlin. How the artificial borders drawn by Europeans still cause conflict today. And most importantly, the hidden resistance, the forgotten voices, and the legacy that Africa is still recovering from. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand how a single meeting in Europe reshaped an entire continent and why it still matters today. Let's begin. To understand what was stolen, we first need to understand what existed. In the 1870s and early 1880s, Africa was not a blank slate. It was not a dark continent waiting to be discovered. That myth was a European invention, a convenient lie that justified what came next. Africa in the 19th century was a mosaic of empires, kingdoms, chiefdoms, and city-states. Some were ancient, some were new, but all were complex, organized societies with their own systems of governance, trade, law, and culture. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire controlled a vast territory rich in gold. Their capital, Kumasi, was a thriving city with royal courts, markets, and sophisticated political structures. The Ashanti traded with Europeans, yes, but on their own terms. They were not subjects. They were rivals. In southern Africa, the Zulu Kingdom, under the leadership of King Cetshwayo, commanded one of the most disciplined and effective military forces on the continent. The Zulu had defeated British forces in battle multiple times. They were a power to be reckoned with. In East Africa, the Kingdom of Buganda, located in present-day Uganda, controlled trade routes around Lake Victoria. The Kabaka, the king, ruled over the centralized government with provinces, governors, and a sophisticated court system. In the Horn of Africa, the Ethiopian Empire remained one of the few African states with international diplomatic recognition. Under Emperor Johannes IV and later Menelik II, Ethiopia maintained its sovereignty and even expanded its territory. And then there were the Islamic empires of the Sahel, the Sokoto Caliphate in present-day Nigeria, the Tukuler Empire in present-day Senegal and Mali, and the Sultanate of Zanzibar on the East African coast. These were not isolated villages. These were states with armies, universities, and long-distance trade networks stretching across the Sahara, the Indian Ocean, and into the Middle East. But Europe didn't see empires. Europe saw opportunity. By the 1880s, Europe was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Factories in Britain, Germany, France, and Belgium were producing goods at an unprecedented scale. But production requires raw materials, rubber, timber, ivory, cotton, minerals, palm oil. And Africa had all of it. But there was a problem. For most of the 19th century, European contact with Africa was limited to coastal trading posts. European merchants would trade guns, cloth, and alcohol for African goods, gold, ivory, enslaved people. But Europeans didn't control the interior. African kingdoms did. That began to change in the 1870s. Technological advances, steamships, the Maxim gun, quinine to treat malaria made it possible for Europeans to venture deeper into Africa. Explorers like David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and Pierre Savignon de Brazza traveled up African rivers, mapped territories, and reported back to European capitals about the wealth waiting to be claimed. At the same time, European nations were in fierce competition. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and Italy all wanted to expand their empires. If one country claimed a piece of Africa, another would try to block it or claim their own piece. Tensions were rising, and that's when Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, stepped in. Germany under Bismarck was a latecomer to the colonial game. Britain and France already had colonies. Portugal had been in Africa for centuries. But Germany had almost nothing. And Bismarck was worried, not about Africa necessarily, but about European stability. He feared that competition over Africa would lead to war between European powers. So he proposed a solution, a conference. If the European powers could sit down and agree on rules for dividing Africa peacefully, diplomatically, then everyone could expand their empires without conflict. At least that was the pitch. In reality, Bismarck wanted to secure German interests in Africa while appearing as a neutral mediator, and it worked. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin. Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and the United States. Notice who wasn't invited. Africa. Not a single African king, queen, diplomat, or representative was present. Not the Ashanti, not the Zulu, not the Ethiopians, no one. Europe was about to decide the fate of a continent without the people who lived there. Let's meet the players in this high-stakes game, Germany and Otto von Bismarck, the host and the architect. Bismarck was a master diplomat. He didn't care much about colonies. He saw them as expensive distractions, but he understood power. By hosting the conference, he positioned Germany as a key player in European politics and secured German claims in East and Southwest Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium, perhaps the most sinister figure at the conference. Leopold didn't represent Belgium officially. He represented himself as the head of the International African Association. His target, the Congo Basin. Leopold claimed he wanted to bring civilization and Christianity to Africa. In reality, he wanted rubber and ivory, and he was willing to commit atrocities to get them. We'll return to his story later. Britain, the dominant global empire, represented by Sir Edward Mallet. Britain already controlled Egypt, parts of West Africa and Southern Africa. Their goal at the conference was simple: protect what they had and grab what they could. Britain wanted the Nile River, the Cape, and anything in between. France, represented by Baron de Courcelles, France had already established control over Algeria and parts of West Africa. Their ambition was to create a continuous empire from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, a horizontal band across Africa. Portugal, the oldest European presence in Africa dating back to the 1400s. Portugal controlled Angola and Mozambique, but other powers, especially Britain and Germany, were trying to limit Portuguese expansion. Italy, Spain, and the smaller powers, hungry for prestige and territory, but lacking the resources of Britain or France, they would grab whatever was left over. And then there were the Africans, the people whose land was being divided, whose futures were being written by strangers. At the time of the Berlin Conference, Africa was home to powerful rulers who had no idea what was happening in that conference room. King Prempeh, the first of the Ashanti, a young king who inherited a powerful empire. He would later resist British colonization, but by then the borders had already been drawn. King Cetshwayo of the Zulu, a brilliant military strategist who had defeated the British at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. But after his defeat later that year, his kingdom was fractured. The British would use the Berlin Conference to justify further encroachment. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia, one of the few African leaders who understood what was happening. Menelik would later defeat Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, preserving Ethiopia's independence, but he was not invited to Berlin. Samurai Toure, a Muslim military leader in West Africa who built a powerful empire in present-day Guinea, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire. He resisted French colonization for nearly 2 decades, but the Berlin Conference gave France the legal justification to invade his territory. These were not primitive societies. These were nations with armies, economies, and diplomatic traditions. But in Berlin, they were treated as if they didn't exist. On November 15th, 1884, the Berlin Conference officially opened. The location was the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a grand building designed to project German power and prestige. The atmosphere was cordial, champagne flowed, handshakes were exchanged, but beneath the pleasantries, this was a negotiation among rivals. Each nation wanted to maximize its gains while minimizing conflict with the others.